Hey everyone, what is going on, and welcome back to another video from A Man Talks NRL SuperCoach. And in today's video we're going to be going through the round 2 team list Tuesday. Let's get in. So before we get into team list, just wanted to give a quick shout out to Perpetual Motion, who topped out our overall group league to begin the round. He had a massive 1,436 points to begin the season, and he's already ranked in the top 100, which is an absolutely amazing effort. So big props to him. If you guys aren't in that group league, there's a code in the description below. But let's get into the rest of the team lists. So round 2 kicks off with the Eels and the Storm playing on Thursday night at Bankwest Stadium. The only change with the Eels outfit is that Keegan Hipgrave has been moved out of the 17 and into the reserves with the return of Marata Niokore from his suspension, and he moves onto the bench now. But in terms of the starting lineup for the Eels, it's the exact same as what was played last round, and I wouldn't expect any more surprises in terms of, say, like the minutes. The only question I had from last week was maybe Nathan Brown was only playing about, I think, 55-ish minutes, and I thought he'd be playing more close to that 70 kind of minute range. So that is something to keep an eye on. I think a lot of that was due to Isaiah Papali'i and his performance, so he may potentially be a good one to keep an eye on. But otherwise, overall with the Eels, very settled outfit. In terms of the makeup of the Eels bench, it's the same as last week, where they had 3 forwards and that one kind of utility role in Will Smith. So again, I don't really expect too many changes, maybe potentially in the minutes. We'll just have to one of those things we'll have to keep an eye on. It's not enough to just go off round 1. For the Storm, they're basically 1 to 17, no kind of new injury concerns. Obviously, they're still missing guys like Harry Grant and Dale Finucane. But in terms of their bench, exact same as what it was come game day. Obviously, Tyson Smoothy was named out on the reserves before on Team List Tuesday, but he moved into that bench role prior to kickoff. And he's retained that spot, which does suggest that, Brandon Smith is going to get spelled at some point playing at hooker, but I can still expect him to be playing around that 60 to 65 minute mark. He's obviously one that I think a lot of people are going to have some question marks over, given that he only produced about 43 points I think last round, and I think a lot of people were hoping for a lot more than him in the absence of Harry Grant. So I don't know if it's necessarily like a sell for Brandon Smith this week. Even with Tyson Smoothy on the bench, I'd still expect some good minutes from him, and I think I would maybe hold him at least for this round to kind of see what the minutes makeup is going to be, and from there you can maybe potentially then pivot on to other second row forwards before the price changes kick in round 3. Similar kind of narrative I think with Christian Welch. Him getting that 52 points I think is not a massive concern, and to be honest I think him getting around that 50 to 60 mark is probably what I would expect throughout the season. So I don't think he really deviated too much from what his potential is. So I don't think he's like an immediate concern or anything. I think I would just continue to hold as well. In terms of the game itself, I'm hoping for a really good game. It's at Bankwest, which should hopefully give the Eels some more confidence. I own Dylan Brown as well, and I'm not quite sure yet what I'm going to do this round with him, whether I want to hold or potentially move and flip him to like a Jaden Brayley via Connor Watson, who's currently in my hook position. Something I've been thinking about. I think Dylan Brown still was going to be a good player, and last week he only came around with 39 points, but it was basically all in base, so he really does have a high floor. The only negative is that he is versing the Storm, so I don't know how well he's going to go and whether I actually want to hold him, because I expect if he again scores relatively low, say the 40-50 mark, his price is going to go down a lot come round 3. So I may potentially just do that trade early. But yeah, otherwise not too many changes to talk about with the Eels and the Storm. So the next game is the Warriors versus the Knights. I think the Warriors had a really good showing against the Titans. It looked like they were really solid in defense, and there's not too many changes with them. Obviously the most notable out is Ewan Aiken, who's now picked up I think like an ankle injury, and he's going to be out for 8 to 10 weeks. So Adam Pompey replaces him at centre. In terms of the rest of the side, I think Adam Fanua-Blake looked really good in that first game, getting about 65 points in his 58 minutes, which is I think a really good showing from him. Tohu Harris again, obviously I think he got 65 or 66, which I suggested that's basically what you can always expect from him. He's super consistent. Nikorima had a really good game as well, with the goal kicking plus the getting that try as well. Not quite sure yet what the situation is in terms of the goal kicking. From what I've gathered, I think Nikorima is still going to hold the goal kicking for at least maybe this round and maybe a couple more weeks. We're just not quite sure yet. That was the main reason I actually deviated away from Harris Tavita and went with Jamal Fogarty instead, because I thought that little added goal kicking bonus is really what attracted me to Harris Tavita as well. Again, one of those things to keep an eye on in the news and see if that gets confirmed in any way. But aside from that, Warriors very settled apart from that Ewan Aiken injury. The bench makeup is the same as what it was last round, with that 4 forward bench. So yeah, I don't expect too many kind of surprises coming out of that Warriors game in terms of say the minutes. With the Knights, very settled. Obviously they had some concerns coming into this game. with Kurt Mann and Braden Best having some injury problems, but they seem to have gotten over that and are ready to go for this round as well. They're named 1 to 17. Obviously, we did see prior to the game that Connor Watson was swapped out to the number 14 role with Suaso Sui coming in at number 13. Honestly, I wouldn't be too surprised if that happens again, given that I don't think Connor Watson's role was quite done what he was maybe intended to, given that Kurt Mann had that injury and he had to come in and fill that at 5'8". So if, say, Kurt Mann plays the full game at number 6, we can then see Connor Watson and his role and how he's used. Either way, I don't think there's too many concerns with him, given that he scored fairly well for his price, and I expect him to still make a good impact off the bench if that does happen again. The story of last week for the Knights, I think, was all about the forwards, with Clemmer, Saifidi and Barnett all going huge. Barnett, I think, is going to be a really, really popular trade-in for this week, and I'm not surprised. He was very low owned to begin the season. To be honest, probably someone I unfortunately overlooked. I knew that he had good credentials, but for some reason I just didn't really think about him long enough to consider him. With that goal kicking, he really does become an appealing option. And obviously the talk is that, when Ponga comes back, Ponga will take up the goal kicking and Barnett's going to lose it. But for over the next few weeks, if Barnett seems to be kicking them at a pretty good clip, I wouldn't be surprised, because Ponga sometimes does have his problems with the goal kicking. Barnett potentially might just hold that goal kicking duties. We're not quite sure. And if he does, then he becomes a good long season hold, not just like a short-term punt to maximize the time that he is goal kicking. So I think he's definitely going to be a player that a lot of people are going to be bringing in. I don't quite know how I myself might get myself to him this round, but someone I'm definitely keeping an eye on and looking at my squad, seeing how I can maybe tinker with it to potentially get him in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, aside from that, pretty interested in this game. Obviously the Knights had a good display last week against the Dogs, and the Warriors did as well against Titans. So I think this is going to be a pretty even game. It's quite hard to call this, but in terms of the team news, not too much to report on. So next up, we've got the Titans and the Broncos. I'm really looking forward to this Friday night match, the Queensland derby between the two. In terms of the Titans lineup, the only real notable absentee is Brian Kelly, who unfortunately has fractured his hand, and I think he's due to come back around round 5. So really unfortunate for Kelly owners. I was very high on him to begin the season, and I really recommended him. Didn't have a great game last week, but he only scored 47 without any real attacking upside, which really shows that he has got good base and a pretty decent floor. So Philip Sammy is going to be replacing him for the next few weeks. Apart from that, the rest of the Titans side is very settled, and if anyone had question marks over guys like, say, Fogarty, who I have in my team, for example, I'm not too concerned with him, to be honest, given that he did only score 40 last week, but it was 40 where the Titans only scored 6 points, and he really had no involvement at all in attacking upside. So if that's a game where he doesn't get any attacking points and he gets 40, I'm pretty happy with that. It shows that if he is able to nab a try, or if he gets a couple of try assists, he's able to go into that 60 to 70 point range. So I think I wouldn't be too concerned if you have him, or say like Ash Taylor. I think they're still good holds. I think they just came up against the Warriors side, who looked really solid in defense, and the Titans attack isn't quite fully gelled yet. Given that they've got so many new big players who they're trying to fit in and still work on those combinations. Makeup at the bench, exact same as last week, so I don't think there should be any surprises in terms of how the minutes are spread across the forwards. Broncos, a couple of things to report on them. Obviously, the biggest one is Matt Lodge, who's out for the next kind of 2 to 4 weeks, I think, given that hamstring issue he's picked up. Really unfortunate, given that a lot of people would have had Matt Lodge from round 1, given that potential for him to play big minutes and get good points while Payne Haas was out. But unfortunately, with this injury, he's basically going to be out for that time when Haas is out. By the time he's back, Payne Haas is going to be back too, and that kind of advantage of his bigger minutes and bigger responsibility in the forwards is negated. So I wouldn't say he's necessarily like a straight sell. Obviously, if you haven't got any kind of good front row forward cover, say for example, he was in one of your starting 2 front rows, could potentially run with someone like Spencer Linu as your second starting front row forward, but that's a bit of a risk, given that obviously Linu had a good display last week, but we just don't quite know if that's minutes is going to be maybe the same, or his output would be the same. If you had Matt Lodge, say, as your kind of one of your reserve front rows, you could potentially hold him if you wanted to address other areas of your team. In terms of who's going to be replacing him, Thomas Flegler is going to be replacing him at the starting forward prop position, with Reece Kennedy then moving on to the bench. So the Broncos are still running with a 4 forward bench. Obviously, other guys who had some issues coming in were Xavier Coates and Johnny Asiata. they obviously seem to have gotten over their issues and should be good to go for round 2. But yeah, otherwise not too much in terms of team ins and outs on the Broncos. In terms of some of the players, David Mead is obviously one I think a lot of people are going to be keeping a close eye on, given that he had a good 77-point effort last week, and he's also priced in that 230k cheapy centre range. So I think a lot of guys who potentially aren't so hot on, say, like Jason Saab, maybe Fusatua, they might look to Mead, as he's probably going to go have a nice initial price rise come round 3. In terms of the forwards, Tavita Pangai Jr. had a really solid game. He had a very he's very much used as like a big impact player. I think he only played something in like the 40 something minutes, but in that time he scored 70 plus points. So I think, yeah, one to keep an eye on. I wasn't really one to go for him to begin the season because I thought he was a little bit too expensive for me. And I guess with Matt Lodge being out, potentially you could argue there's greater workload for guys like TPJ, Carrigan and Ricky, hopefully. Obviously Ricky's going to be a super popular one, but they'll cover off the Titans and Broncos game. So next we've got the Bulldogs and the Panthers. The Bulldogs have a few ins and outs in their squad. So Jeremy Marshall-King is returning to the bench, and that takes out Brad Dietz out of the 17. And Raymond Faitala-Mariner is now moved to the starting second row, with Corey Waddell moving to the bench. Aside from that, no other changes to report in the Bulldog squad. Bit of SuperCoach interest here in terms of, say, like I think a lot of people would have been looking at Jack Hetherington, Ogden, Josh Jackson. I don't think there's too many kind of concerns over their minutes, say, for this week, given that the bench makeup is the same as last week. I would be concerned if you had guys like, say, Hetherington, given that he just didn't seem to show the work rate that I would have been hoping for if you're looking to have him as like an early season cash cow. He played like 58 minutes, but he only scored about the 30 something points. It's not really a great PPM. Faitala-Mariner, I was actually hoping he would just stay on the bench for longer because he did only score about 20 something points last week, and I was hoping that he could continue just coming off the bench for a little bit of time. Hopefully his price would slide and then we could pick him up dirt cheap, because he does look like someone in the Bulldogs who, if I was going to go anywhere in the forward, in terms of the forwards, it'd probably be him. He does seem to always have a knack for getting over the try line, so he's something I'm definitely keeping an eye on as well. Jake Averillo, unfortunately, he only got that 18-point effort, something like that, I think, last round. And coming up against the Panthers, who are a very strong defense, I don't quite know how much more points potential he has this week. Probably worthwhile to note that over the weekend it is expected to be raining quite a bit in the Sydney area. And typically that does have an impact on the creative attacking players, given that the games are a little bit slower and the points usually just aren't as high. So, if you want to maybe take that into account, plus coming up against a tough team, if Averillo's in your side and you're looking to move on, I can't really discourage a sell this week, given that he's got that really low score in his rolling average. And you could move to guys who are similar price, like Blake Ferguson, for example, or you could even downgrade to potentially a David Mead. Doesn't have to be this round, but could be next round as well, if you just want to create some extra money to put somewhere else in your team. In terms of the Panthers, very, very settled. Absolutely no changes to report here. No real injury concerns. Bench and starting makeup the same as what it was from last week. So I think, you know what you're going to get from the Panthers. A lot of SuperCoach relevant options here. I think if you've got guys like Brian To'o, I think they're going to be a very, very good play this week against the Bulldogs. I can expect some tries down his side. Obviously, a lot of question marks over Charlie Sands, given that he only scored that 18 points. I wouldn't be looking to sell him this week, given that they are going up against the Dogs. Potentially, I think he's another one to wait and see before maybe round 3, where you might want to sell him. But I definitely would be playing him in my starting centers this week. The other kind of question mark, I think, is Apisai Coruscant. He only scored, 28 points and only played 40-something minutes last week. Not quite sure why. I think he potentially might have picked up a knock and was just being a bit more, and was being managed. The Panthers had that game relatively comfortable. But yeah, so definitely some question marks over him. Again, probably one that I would recommend maybe just to wait one more round if you can. But I completely understand, wanting to sell him and downgrade him, because there's so many other good hooker options like Jaden Brayley, Reed Miney if you want to go for an initial price rise, given that he had that really big score last week. And then some cheaper hookers like, say, if you didn't start with Jacob Little or Connor Watson, for example. So Coruscant, I think, is definitely going to be one who I'll expect to see a lot of trades out for. And given that his price quite high, he does free up a lot of money that people will prioritize elsewhere in their team. But yeah, apart from that, Capewell, I don't really see how the minutes are going to differ too much for the guys like Kikau, Capewell, and Liam Martin. And Spencer Linu and Leota, two props to keep an eye on. I think I'm very happy to have Linu as one of my, my cash cow generating front row forwards. He looked really impressive. But yeah, otherwise very settled side with the Panthers. So next up, we got the Sea Eagles versus the Rabbitohs. The only real notable change to report from the Sea Eagles is that Andrew Davey, guy I kind of talked about preseason as hopefully a good mid-range second row forward cash cow, he has moved to the starting role at the expense expense of Jaskizuski, who's now moved to the bench. Davey, someone I'm definitely going to have a try and watch that game, see how he performs. He did come off the bench last week and looked pretty good. I think if he has another good outing this game, and we'll also see how his minutes are as well, because it's someone, for example, if he played 80 minutes, I think previously last season when he played 80 minutes, he was getting scores 60 plus. So if he's able to kind of knock out a score like that, if he's getting that 80 minutes, I'd be really tempted to bring him in the next round. But apart from that, I wouldn't really go, especially against the Rabbitohs, who are tough side. Guys like Jason Saab, Daly Cherry Evans. I know Jason Saab only scored 11 points. I just don't think the game was quite there for the Sea Eagles last round. They just got blown off the park, so they honestly didn't have that many attempts really down at the Roosters try line. And to be honest, I don't know how much more that's going to happen in this game as well. I could see the Rabbitohs winning this very comfortably. So I know he's one that a lot of people might be looking to sell to, say, David Mead. I would maybe just hold him for another week, and he's on my bench anyway. I'm not going to be playing in my 17, and I wouldn't recommend playing him in your 17. But I don't think he's a priority sell, given that he's so cheap already. I think there are other bigger issues in my team that I might want to be tackling first. In terms of the Rabbitohs, there are a few notable changes here. So the big ones are Josh Mansell and Jacob Host, both being dropped out of the 17 entirely, which is huge for Mansell owners. I know a couple of people had asked in the comments whether they wanted to hold or sell him. Look, I think after getting that really low score the previous round and then being dropped, I think he becomes a sell. I think it's just too much money in your centers to be just leaving on your bench, hoping that he comes back soon. So I think if I had Mansell, I would definitely be selling. I would maybe, you've got a lot of options if you do have him at that price. You can move down to Brian To'o, probably would be my number one target, I think, given that Panthers early draw and he looked really impressive. And Jacob Host, I think he was kind of a popular option coming into round one, given that he was named in the starting lineup for the Rabbitohs. But if he's out of the whole 17, I think he also then becomes a bit of a sell. And so replacing him is Keon Koloamatangi into the starting lineup, and Patrick Margot moves now onto the bench in replacement. And Jackson Paulo will replace Josh Mansell's wing spot at the Rabbitohs as well. What is interesting, I guess, is that the bench is the same as what it was from last week. And Tom Burgess was able to overcome that kind of burner issue. I wouldn't be surprised to see maybe someone like Jai Arrow move into that starting lineup just prior to the game. But either way, I think Arrow looked really impressive off the bench last week. Definitely someone I'm going to be keeping an eye on this round as well. See how his minutes are, see how he performs, before maybe thinking about bringing him into my team if he scores well again and looks to have a good price rise. But yeah, I think if you own guys like Latrell, Cody Walker, Alex Johnston, Damien Cook, I think they're all very, very good players this week. I can see Latrell and Cody Walker going huge this round against the Sea Eagles. Damien Cook, I guess, is a bigger question mark, given that he didn't really perform that well last week. Personally, and if I did have him, I think I would play him and hold him. I don't think I'd be selling him this round. I would just want to wait and see how they perform against the Sea Eagles. If the Rabbitohs crank out 36 points and he only scores, say, maybe 40 to 50 points, I think that's a sign that potentially he's not going to be as involved in the attack as we would hope. And I think then he becomes a sell because he's very, very expensive. And you do have the flexibility then. You could go downgrade to a Jaden Brayley and create almost 300k elsewhere. And you could pump that into a cheapy center and turn that person into a Brian To'o, for example. So I think definitely a hold for this week. I don't begrudge people selling if they want to be making changes quickly, just to kind of attack the early rounds of trades so that they can get all the players who are going to go up in value. So I wouldn't discourage people from selling him, but I personally would just hold him. But apart from that, nothing else to really report on for the Rabbitohs. Next, we've got the Cowboys versus the Dragons. The Cowboys, very settled team, named 1 to 17 with the same bench as well. The only real question mark in the Cowboys is really Jason Taumalolo, given that he only scored 36 points, playing 51 minutes last round. I think if you own Jason Taumalolo, for me, you could say yes, you can wait and see how he's used again this round, but Todd Payton's come out and he's made it very, very clear in where he stands in terms of how he's going to use Taumalolo. So for me, I can see for the foreseeable future that Taumalolo gets used in that 50-minute role, and that really then does reduce his output. I wouldn't expect 36 points from him, obviously, even if he played 50 minutes. I'll probably be more expecting around the 50 mark, but even at his price, that still means he's going to go down in value quite a bit. And I think there's so many other good second row forward options. I think if I had Taumalolo, I would probably sell this round, given that there's probably other changes in your team that you might want to make before the price changes kick in. So I think Taumalolo then becomes a sell, and at his price, you can really go down to anyone. In terms of the Dragons, pretty settled team as well. The only inclusion is Corey Norman, who moves in for Adam Clune, who's dropped out of the 17 altogether. Terrell Fumiano named again at lock, which is encouraging for me given that I have him on my bench. And he scored 56 points last week, which I was really happy to see. And hopefully if he continues in this similar role that he did last week and he's able to knock out another 40 to 50 points, I'd be looking to get him in just as a bit of an early season cash cow, given that he's only priced about 260k. But aside from that, there's not really anyone else at the Dragons I'm too interested in. Obviously, Andrew McCullough, he had a decent showing last week, scoring, I think, 65, 64. You know what you're going to get from him. He's just going to make a bunch of tackles. He's all base. So I think priced about 470k, you could potentially go with him. But apart from that, there's not really too much interest apart from maybe those two players in the Dragons. So next up, we've got the Roosters versus the West Tigers. In terms of the Tigers, the main change is that Adam Dewey has come back into the round 2 side, and he's moved back into that 5'8" role, pushing Moses Mbye onto the bench, and then Russell Packer drops out of that bench into the reserve. I guess the question mark over the Tigers with Mbye moving to number 14 is the impact it has on Jacob Little and his minutes. Really encouraging last week to see him play the full 80, but we all kind of knew that with Dewey returning, Mbye moving to 14 was the likely outcome, and then he might spell Jacob Little at times, playing in that number 9 role. So I think if you have Little, still a very safe hold. I don't know if I'd play him in my 17 this round, but I think if you're a non-owner, this is a good round to kind of see how the minutes shape up, given that this is probably going to be how the Tigers long-term are going to be structured. And I think, if he still plays maybe 60, 70 minutes and has a good score, then I think you can maybe jump on him for early cash generation. He only had about, I think, 44 points in base in his 80 minutes, which is not super encouraging. You'd probably hope for more than that if your hooker is playing 80 minutes. But it was good to see he got the try, which bumped up his score. But yeah, I think he'll purely just be a bit of a cash cow option for us to begin the season. In terms of that bench, given that Russell Packer has come out, they've got Otamanu and McKaylee, who are 2 middles, and I think that does spell some good news for the rest of the forwards in the Tigers. Obviously, them two themselves might get a little bit more minutes, which is good for guys like Otamanu, who I think a lot of people have as a cheap front row option. Twal, Leilua, Offengawi, they might then all benefit with increased minutes. So I think, Offengawi had a good showing last round, and with that bench losing another middle, I think he potentially might go up in minutes and hopefully go up in points as well. So I think he does become a good consideration at that kind of mid-price second row or front row option that you can put into your team. Moving on to the Roosters, so there's a bit of change here with the Roosters lineup. Obviously, biggest one is Angus Crichton has got that suspension for 1 round for that crusher tackle, so he'll be out for this round, but he'll be back in round 3. Personally, I don't think he's a sell at all. He's an absolute gun, and I think if you have to trade him out this round, you're going to be wanting to bring him back almost straight away. That's 2 trades you're already using just on the one player in the matter of like a week. And I think it's not worth it. I think if you've hopefully built your side to have a bit of, bench cover, I think it just means just playing them instead of Crichton and just copying the points hit for the week. I wouldn't be looking to sell him at all. Jake Friend is another out given that concussion. Don't quite know actually yet what his return date's going to be. Obviously the Roosters are very conservative with the players in terms of, when they get head knocks and concussions. So I don't know if he'd come back into the side straight away next week, but kind of want to keep an eye on and see. And Adam Kieran, he had that dislocated wrist issue, and I think he's expected to be out for 4 to 6 weeks. So the guys who replace him will be Fletcher Baker moves into the bench, with Nat Butcher moving to the starting lineup for the Roosters. Freddie Lussick comes in at number 9, and Drew Hutchinson comes in at number 14 to kind of fill in for Adam Kieran. Just looking at that bench, I'm not quite sure what it means for guys like, say, Lachlan Lamb. I don't know if Freddie Lussick will play the full 80 minutes. Potentially what might happen, in my opinion, is, if Lussick goes off for a spell, Lamb might then go into number 9, and Drew Hutchinson, who can play in the halves, could then go into the 5'8" role, and then him and Kiri could just switch. But apparently Hutchinson can also play in the second row forward, so he might just be used maybe as a middle forward or an edge player as well. Apart from that, very settled side for the Roosters. I don't quite know what I'm going to do with Lachlan Lamb this round. I think for me he's going to be a bit of a hold, given that they are versing the Tigers, which is a favourable matchup for them. I completely understand why people might want to be selling. There are a lot of good hooker and 5'8" options around his price as well. I think what I'm thinking about doing is maybe just giving it one more round to kind of see how he performs this week. If the Roosters, I don't expect the Roosters to blow out the Tigers as they did to the Sea Eagles, but if the Roosters have a good showing and he again doesn't really look too involved in the attack, I think he then becomes a sell for me, because I think he'll cop a massive price drop in the following round. But aside from that, obviously Tedesco I think is a very, very safe captain option this round, given that he's got that he's coming off that massive game against Sea Eagles, and they're versing the Tigers, which is a decent game. In terms of the forwards, Takeaho, he only had that 43 minutes last round, and his points were boosted by that try assist he got towards the end of the game. There is a bit of concern in that in those easier games, they do typically rest their forwards and give them a bit of a longer extended break. But the goal kicking options at the Roosters, I don't think were too good. Teddy didn't look that good with his goal kicking, so hopefully that means that Takeaho does spend a bit longer on the field, given that he is going to be the primary goal kicker. And Lindsay Collins, really interesting. I think he potentially might be one who's set for bigger minutes throughout the rest of the season. So I think he could be a decent one to look at in terms of a mid-range front row forward cash cow option. So the final game of the round is the Sharks versus the Raiders. Not much to report for either team here. The biggest one for the Sharks is Jesse Ramian getting that suspension, so he'll be out for the next 3 games. And that means Moani Hiratori moves into his centre lineup. But with the Sharks, I don't see how there's too much SuperCoach relevance from them. I think the main ones will be Matt Moylan, who had a pretty decent game last round against the Dragons. I'm not an owner of him, but someone I'm also wanting to see how he performs this round. He could potentially be a Lachlan Lamb downgrade, although I do feel that trade is a little bit sideways, but it does create some money, and if Moylan has another good game against the Raiders, his value should go up. The only thing though is that he scored 53 and it was against the Dragons, who are one of probably the easiest teams to play against, I think, this season, whereas the Raiders, who I think are going to be a top 4 side. So we'll see how he goes against a tough team, because I think the Sharks do have an easy game against the Cowboys following, but I think the next few games after that are a bit tough. So I don't know how he's going to perform overall. If you've got him in your side, obviously you hold him. I wouldn't maybe play him in your 17. But apart from that, I think not too much to report on for the Sharks. And finally, with the Raiders, very settled, named 1 to 17 from last round. Sebastian Chris stays in the centre. I think Jared Coker, from more reports that I've read, he seems almost ready to go, but I think they just want to improve his conditioning. And with the forwards, it's encouraging, I think, for any Ryan James owners to see that he's still named on the bench. And I think obviously he scored that try last week, which really boosted his points up to that 69 points. I don't own him myself. I think I'm going to give it another week to see how the minutes shape up for Ryan James before maybe looking to bring him into my front row or second row forward bench. There's a lot of back row interest, I think, in the Raiders though, with like Tarpany, Hudson Young. Tarpany especially played 43 minutes and he scored 100 points. He obviously did have some attacking stats in there, but with that PPM is unbelievable. The only question with him, I think, is the minutes, really. Playing only 43 minutes, he's not going to get those attacking stats every round. So whether or not he's going to be scoring 143 minutes again, I wouldn't expect so. Obviously, another concern would be someone like, say, Josh Hodgson. So he played the full 80 minutes, which was a good sign, but he only scored 30-something points. So I think if you're a Josh Hodgson owner, I would still hold and play him this round and see how he performs. But, if he doesn't do too well, I would probably look to sell to someone like, say, Jaden Braley, who's very similar priced, because Jaden Braley I'd expect to go up in value. And Josh Papali'i, obviously I kind of failed to mention in my roundup video that he had that sin bin right at the end of the game, because he only scored 33, but obviously that sin bin took off a lot of points. But even with that, he only would have scored in the 40s, and from Papali'i, for when you're paying that much for him, you want to be seeing 60 plus points minimum. So maybe someone I'd keep an eye on as well. I wouldn't immediately just rage trade him out. He's got to, in this game, he could very easily probably score a try. But yeah, someone to kind of keep an eye on. Hudson Young as well looked really, really impressive. And he's definitely someone I'm keeping an eye on. I think if I were to go into that Raiders forwards, in say the starting lineup, I think Hudson Young would be the one that I might be targeting. And yeah, in terms of the bench, good news for Hodgson, I guess, that there's no Tom Starling still, so he's probably set to play another 80 minutes. And yeah, Ryan James, who I've already touched on. Alright guys, that's the team list for round 2. Obviously not as kind of exciting as round 1. Round 1 is obviously going to be the biggest team list Tuesday of the year. But not too many surprises. I think a few teams had some injuries and some suspensions. But yeah, a lot of question marks and trade dilemmas I think that a lot of people are going to be going through. Definitely one that I'm, a lot of trade scenarios that I'm running through my head as well. But yeah, if you guys did like this video, would really appreciate a thumbs up. And do please consider subscribing, as I'll be going through the team list and other content throughout the rest of the 2021 SuperCoach season. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video.